They told my son I never paid a dime. My own daughter believed it too. For 8 years, I sat quiet and let them believe it, because I thought silence was kindness. I was wrong. Dead wrong. And it took one manila folder on a Thanksgiving table to prove it. My name is Walter Emerson. I'm 66 years old. I spent 41 years running Emerson Comfort Air and Heat out of a cinder block building on 51st Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the same business my own father started with 2 trucks and a phone number people wrote on the back of church bulletins. I believed, for most of my life, that if you did right by people quietly, without needing credit for it, that quiet would eventually speak for itself. I believed silence was a kind of dignity. I was wrong about that, and it cost me 8 years with my children before I understood exactly how wrong. I'm going to tell you about the night I finally stopped being quiet. It's a moment I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The sound of a room going completely still, the sound of my own daughter's fork hitting a plate. But before I get to that, let me back up, because you need to understand how a man ends up sitting at his own son's dinner table getting called a liar by people who used to call him dad. Diane and I were married for 34 years. We met at a roller rink off Memorial Drive in 1982, when I was 22 years old wearing a windbreaker I thought made me look like somebody. She was studying to be a dental hygienist. I was 3 years into working for my father, learning how to solder copper pipe, and read a wiring diagram by flashlight in somebody's crawlspace. We married in the spring of 1984 at a small Methodist church on Yale Avenue, and 11 months later we had Preston, and 4 years after that, Kayla. I want to be honest with you about something right up front, because it matters for everything that comes later. I was not a perfect husband. I worked long hours, sometimes 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during the brutal Tulsa summers when every air conditioner in 3 counties seemed to fail on the same Tuesday. I missed a Little League game here, a piano recital there. Diane carried more of the day-to-day raising of those kids than I did, and I've never once denied that. But I built something. By 2005, Emerson Comfort Air and Heat had 11 trucks, 19 employees, and a reputation in Tulsa County that meant people called us first when their unit died in a 104-degree heat wave. I built that so my family would never have to worry about money. That was always the whole point. In 2015, after 31 years of marriage, Diane told me she wanted a divorce. She said she felt like she'd spent 3 decades married to a business instead of a man. I won't pretend that didn't have some truth buried in it. I didn't fight her on the divorce itself. What I did fight for, quietly and without drama, was making sure our kids never felt the ground shift under them because of it. The divorce was finalized in March of 2016. Diane got the house on Birchbrook Lane in Sapulpa, a 4-bedroom brick colonial we'd bought in 1998. She got half the retirement accounts. The court ordered me to pay $2,400 a month in spousal support for 5 years, plus contribute to whatever remained of Preston and Kayla's college expenses. Preston was already 24 by then and mostly out of school, working construction management. Kayla was 20, a junior at Oklahoma State. Here's the thing nobody in that courtroom knew, and honestly, for years, nobody in my own family knew either. I never stopped at what the court ordered. Not once, not for 8 years. I want to be clear about this, because people ask me why, and it's a fair question. When Diane and I split up, I sat both kids down separately, Preston first, then Kayla, and I told them the same thing. I told them that whatever happened between me and their mother, it was between me and their mother, and it would never, ever touch what I did for them. I meant it as a promise. I didn't realize at the time I was also handing somebody a weapon. Over those 8 years, I paid for far more than the divorce decree required. I covered the rest of Kayla's tuition at Oklahoma State after her scholarship money ran short her senior year, about $14,000 total, paid directly to the bursar's office. I paid $6,200 toward Preston's wedding to a woman named Renata in 2019, a check I wrote directly to the venue, a barn reception hall out near Broken Arrow, because Preston told me his mother said she couldn't help and he didn't want to ask me outright. I bought Kayla's first car, a 2018 Honda Civic, cash, $17,400, the year she graduated, because her old car had 190,000 miles on it, and I lost sleep over her driving it on the turnpike. When Diane's mother, my former mother-in-law Louise, needed a hip replacement in 2020 and Diane called me in a panic because her insurance had a gap, I sent $9,000 without asking a single question, Because Louise had been kind to me for 3 decades, and old debts like that don't just disappear because a marriage does. And then there was the monthly money. Above and beyond the court-ordered $2,400, I sent Diane an additional $1,100 a month for 6 straight years, deposited directly into an account she controlled. Money I told myself was for the kids' stuff, birthdays, holidays, emergencies, the small unglamorous costs of raising 2 young adults who were technically grown but still needed a safety net under them. I never once told Preston or Kayla I was sending that money. I let Diane decide how and when to explain it, if she ever did. That was my mistake. That was the crack in the foundation I didn't see until the whole wall came down. I didn't know it yet, sitting in my empty house on a Tuesday evening in October of 2023, watching the Tulsa Evening News with a plate of leftover meatloaf on my lap. But the version of events my own children believed about me had already been quietly rewritten, one comment at a time, over the better part of a decade. And I was about to walk straight into it. It happened on a Saturday in late November, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Preston and Renata were hosting the holiday that year at their house in Broken Arrow, a modest 3-bedroom on a cul-de-sac they'd bought 2 years earlier. I remember it was cold that week, down in the low 30s overnight, and I'd brought 2 pies from a bakery on 71st Street because I still can't make a decent crust to save my life. Kayla was there with her husband, Dev, and their 18-month-old daughter, my granddaughter, Josie. Diane was there too. She'd been invited, and honestly, by that point, I'd grown used to sharing holidays with her at our kids' houses. 8 years is a long time. You learn to sit at the same table. The dinner itself was fine. Good, even. Preston carved the turkey the way I taught him, slicing against the grain, and Josie banged a wooden spoon against her high-chair tray while everyone laughed. It was somewhere around dessert, when the conversation drifted toward Preston and Renata talking about buying a bigger house, that the whole evening turned. Renata mentioned they were thinking about asking both sets of parents if anyone could help with a down payment, just to open the conversation, nothing pushy about it. And Diane, sitting there with a cup of coffee in front of her, wearing a soft blue cardigan I remembered buying her for Christmas back in 2011, looked at Preston and Kayla and said the sentence that changed everything. Well, you two know how that goes. Your dad gave us nothing when we split up. I raised you both basically on my own dime. I wouldn't hold your breath. The room didn't go quiet right away. That's the strange thing about a lie like that. It doesn't land like a bomb. It lands soft, almost gentle, the way something familiar lands, because apparently it wasn't the first time she'd said some version of it. I watched Preston's face. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man hearing a fact he'd already filed away years ago. Kayla didn't look surprised either. She just glanced at me, quick, almost apologetic, the way you glance at someone when you already believe the worst about them, but you still feel a little bad about it. I sat there with a fork of pecan pie halfway to my mouth, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I can only describe as the specific, cold shock of understanding you've been a stranger in your own family story for a very long time. That's not true, I said. My voice came out quieter than I wanted it to. Diane didn't even flinch. Walter, let's not do this at Thanksgiving. I paid support every month for 5 years, exactly what the court ordered, and I paid extra on top of that the entire time. You know that. I know you paid what the judge told you to pay, she said, setting her coffee down with a small, deliberate click against the saucer. I'm not going to pretend you were generous about it. Preston cleared his throat. Dad, it's fine. We don't need to relitigate the divorce at Thanksgiving. Relitigate. That word sat wrong in my stomach for days afterward, because it meant, somewhere in his mind, this had already been litigated once, a long time ago, without me in the room. I left that dinner about 40 minutes later, said my goodbyes, hugged Josie, thanked Renata for hosting, and drove the 18 minutes back to my house on Birchbrook Ridge with my hands so tight on the steering wheel my knuckles ached the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the porch light on, staring at nothing, running numbers in my head that I hadn't run in years, trying to remember exact figures, exact dates, wondering how many other Thanksgivings, how many other quiet comments over 8 years had built the wall that was now standing between me and my own children. I didn't know it yet, but that wall had a name and a paper trail, and I was about to spend the next several weeks tearing it down to the studs. The next morning, I called my sister Connie. Connie Weatherby is 61, for years younger than me. And she's the only person on this earth who has never once let me get away with feeling sorry for myself without also doing something about it. She lives out in Owasso with her husband Gary, and she'd been divorced once herself, a long time ago, so she understood the terrain better than most. She said, "What?" Connie's voice went sharp through the phone. "That I gave them nothing. In front of Preston, Kayla, her husband, everybody. And you just sat there?" I said it wasn't true. Nobody believed me, Connie. I could see it on their faces. They've believed some version of that story for years. I just never knew it. There was a long pause on the line, the kind Connie takes when she's deciding whether to be gentle with you or honest with you. She chose honest. "Walt, you've been sending that woman money quietly for 8 years and letting her control the whole narrative around it. What did you think was going to happen? You can't outquiet a liar. Silence doesn't defend you. It just gives the other person the microphone." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. Not really. Except to say that I'd built my whole life believing good actions spoke for themselves, and it turned out that theory only works if somebody isn't actively rewriting the transcript behind your back. "You kept records," Connie said. It wasn't a question. She knows me. "Please tell me you kept records." I had. That was the one thing I'd done right without even meaning to. I'm a business owner. I filed taxes for 4 decades. Every wire, every check, every deposit I ever sent Diane or spent directly on our kids had gone through either my business account or my personal checking account at First Oklahoma Trust, and I keep records the way my father taught me to keep records, which is to say, obsessively, for at least 7 years, sometimes longer out of pure habit. "I've got the bank statements," I told her. "Somewhere. Might take some digging." "Then dig," Connie said. "And Walt, when you find it, don't just sit on it and hope somebody notices. You've done that for 8 years. Look where it got you." That Sunday, I drove out to the storage unit I kept on the east side of town, a 10 by 10 climate-controlled space off 21st Street, where I'd been stashing old business files and personal paperwork since I sold the company to my nephew Danny in 2021. I spent 4 hours in that unit with a space heater and a thermos of coffee, going through file boxes labeled in my own handwriting, years fading on the cardboard. I found what I needed by the 3rd box. 8 years of bank statements. Canceled checks with Diane's own endorsement signature on the back, some of them scanned. Some of them the physical carbon copies my bank still mailed me back in the earlier years before everything went digital. A folder of receipts from the university bursar's office for Kayla's tuition payments. The invoice from the wedding venue in Broken Arrow with my name on the billing line and a paid-in-full stamp dated June 2019. Even, tucked in an envelope I'd nearly forgotten about, 3 handwritten thank you cards Diane had sent me over the years, the kind of small courtesy note you send when somebody helps you out. One of them specifically thanking me, in her own handwriting, for covering Mom's surgery. It means more than you know. I sat on an overturned milk crate in that storage unit with those cards in my lap, and I felt something shift in me. Not anger exactly. Something colder and steadier than anger. Clarity, maybe. The specific clarity of a man who realizes he has spent 8 years being quietly erased from his own life, and who has just found, by pure accident of good habit, every tool he needs to write himself back in. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Marlene Voss, a family law attorney with an office on South Boston Avenue downtown, a woman in her late 50s who'd handled my original divorce paperwork back in 2016 and who I hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. She remembered me the second I said my name. "Walter Emerson. It's been a while. What's going on?" I told her everything. The Thanksgiving comment, the years of quiet extra payments, the storage unit, the cards. She let me talk for a good 10 minutes without interrupting, which I've since learned is a very particular skill good lawyers have, letting a person exhaust themselves before they start asking the sharp questions. "Okay," she said finally. "First thing, none of what you're describing is illegal on her part. Lying to your adult children about your generosity isn't a crime, Walter. It's just cruel. I want to be straight with you about that so you don't come in here expecting some big lawsuit. This is an illegal case. This is a documentation case. Then help me build the documentation." "I can absolutely do that," she said. "But I need you to understand what we're actually doing here. We're not suing anybody. We're building a truth file. Something airtight enough that when you put it in front of your kids, there is no wiggle room left for anyone to argue with it. Every dollar, every date, cross-referenced. Can you give me full statement history from your bank? I know somebody there." That somebody was Denise Okafor, a loan officer at First Oklahoma Trust who I'd worked with for over 15 years, first getting business lines of credit for Emerson Comfort Air and Heat, later just as a personal client after I sold the company. Denise is 52, sharp as anything, the kind of person who remembers your kids' names and asks about them every single time you walk in. Not because it's her job, but because she actually means it. I sat across from her desk on a Tuesday morning in early December, and I told her, in broad strokes, what I needed and why. She didn't ask a single unnecessary question. She just nodded, pulled up my account history going back to 2016, and started printing. "You've been sending money to this account every single month for 8 years, she said quietly, scrolling through the transaction history on her monitor. Consistent. Never missed once. Even through the pandemic when a lot of folks were skipping payments left and right. Never missed, I confirmed. She looked up at me over her glasses. "Walter, whatever happened that made you need this, I'm sorry. But I want you to know, looking at 8 years of records like this isn't a man who gave nothing. This is a man who gave more than most people would after a divorce like that. Whatever anybody's telling your kids, the numbers don't lie." I didn't know it yet, sitting there watching Denise print statement after statement, but the numbers were about to do a lot more than just sit quietly in a folder. They were about to change the shape of my family for good, one way or another. And I still had no idea what Diane's reaction was going to be when she found out I'd stopped staying quiet. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. If you're just settling in with your coffee, grab a seat, because this story is about to turn a corner. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you don't want to miss where this one goes. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked with Marlene Voss's paralegal, a patient young woman named Ashley who had a gift for organizing chaos, to put together what eventually became a binder nearly 2 inches thick. Every payment I'd made above and beyond the court order, cross-referenced with dates, amounts, and purpose where I could establish it. The tuition receipts, the wedding venue invoice, the car purchase, receipt from the dealership on Memorial Drive, my name on the title transfer paperwork before I signed it over to Kayla. The hospital billing statement from Louise's hip surgery, showing a $9,000 payment from my account applied directly to her balance. And underneath all of it, like a spine holding the whole thing together, 8 years of bank statements showing that extra $1,100 a month, deposited without fail, month after month, into an account Diane controlled. I also asked Ashley to pull something I hadn't thought about in years. Diane and I had used a family mediator during the divorce, a woman named Sharon Kessler, to work out some of the informal understandings that never made it into the official decree, including a verbal and later emailed agreement that I would continue contributing toward the kids' general expenses beyond the court minimum. Ashley found the old email thread in an archived account I still had access to. Sharon Kessler CC'd on it. Diane's reply in writing, dated April 2016, saying, and I remember reading this line on my kitchen table with my coffee going cold. "Thank you, Walter, this really does help more than the court amount alone would." That email sat in my chest like a stone for days. Not because it proved anything I didn't already know, but because it proved Diane had known, in writing, in her own words, exactly how much I was doing, at the exact moment she chose, years later, to tell our children the opposite. I want to pause here and be honest about something, because people watching this might wonder why I didn't just call Preston and Kayla directly and hash it out over the phone. I thought about it. I really did. But here's the thing about being quietly erased for 8 years. You start to understand that a phone call gets forgotten, gets reframed, gets softened in the retelling. I needed something that couldn't be argued with later, something that would sit on a table in front of everybody at once, undeniable, dated, signed. I had spent 8 years letting silence speak for me, and silence had failed me completely. I wasn't going to make the same mistake with a phone call that could be dismissed as me being defensive or bitter or relitigating things, as Preston had put it. So I waited. I waited for Christmas. Kayla was hosting that year, her and Dev's place in Jenks, a rented 3-bedroom near the river with a fireplace that never quite drew right. I knew Diane would be there. I knew Preston and Renata would be there with Josie, now 19 months old and just starting to say a handful of words. I brought the binder in a plain leather portfolio, the kind I used to carry contracts in when I still ran the business, and I left it in my truck until after dinner. Dinner itself was warm, almost too warm, The kind of gathering where everyone is being a little extra careful with each other because of what happened at Thanksgiving. Diane and I were polite. Preston made a point of asking me about the Sooners' bowl game prospects, which felt like an olive branch even if neither of us said so out loud. Kayla kept refilling my coffee without me asking, which she's done since she was maybe 9 years old, her own quiet way of checking on people she loves. It was after the dishes were cleared, everyone settled into the living room with pie and coffee, Josie asleep on Dev's shoulder, that I stood up and said I had something I wanted to say. I'd rehearsed this moment in my truck for 3 weeks, and even so, my hands were shaking a little when I walked out to get the portfolio. I came back in, sat down at the dining table that was still visible from the living room, and I asked everyone to come sit with me for a few minutes. Diane's face changed the second she saw the leather portfolio. Something flickered there, quick, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but I saw it. She knew exactly what that was before I'd even opened it. I want to say something first, I told them, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. I'm not doing this to ruin Christmas. I'm doing this because I love you both too much to let a lie sit between us for one more year. Preston shifted in his seat. Dad, we don't need to do this again. You do, I said, gentle but firm. Because I think you believe something about me that isn't true, and I think you've believed it for a long time. And I let it happen because I thought staying quiet was the respectful thing to do. I was wrong. I should have said something years ago. I opened the portfolio. I laid the bank statements out first, 8 years of them, fanned across the table like a hand of cards. Then the tuition receipts. Then the wedding venue invoice with my name and the paid stamp. Then the dealership paperwork for Kayla's Civic. Then the hospital billing statement for Louise's surgery. And last, I set down the printed email thread from Sharon Kessler, Diane's own reply highlighted in yellow, thanking me for the extra support. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Kayla picked up the tuition receipts first, her eyes moving down the page, and I watched her face change the way a sky changes right before a storm breaks, slow at first, then all at once. This is my tuition, she said quietly. Fall semester, senior year. I thought Mom paid this from her retirement account. She told me she had to dip into her retirement to cover it. I paid it directly to the bursar, I said. December 3rd, 2018. $14,200. Preston had picked up the wedding invoice. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stared at it, at the venue's letterhead, at his own wedding date printed at the top, at my name on the billing line. You paid for the barn, he said finally. Not a question. His voice had gone very quiet. You told me your mother said she couldn't help. I didn't want you to feel like you had to ask me directly and owe me something for it. So I just paid it and let you two believe whatever your mother told you about where the money came from. Diane hadn't touched a single piece of paper on that table. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face doing something complicated, something between defiance and a kind of cornered stillness I'd seen on her exactly once before, back during the divorce itself, the day her own attorney told her the house appraisal had come in lower than she expected. Walter, she said, this isn't the time or place. You said I gave the kids nothing, I said, and I kept my voice even, because I had promised myself I would not raise it, not once, no matter what happened. In front of everyone, at Thanksgiving, and apparently, based on what I'm seeing on my own children's faces right now, that's not the first time they've heard some version of that. Kayla looked up at her mother. Her voice, when it came, wasn't angry yet. It was something worse than angry. It was hurt, the raw, disbelieving kind. Mom, you told me you paid my whole senior year tuition. You told me that story more than once. You said it was hard on you. Diane's jaw tightened. I contributed plenty over the years that nobody's bothering to put on a piece of paper. That's not what I asked, Kayla said. I asked if this is my tuition receipt with Dad's payment on it. And it is, and you told me a completely different story about where that money came from. I want to be fair here, because it matters, and because I promised myself going into this that I would tell the whole truth, not just the parts that make me look good. Diane had, in fact, contributed plenty over the years in ways that weren't on paper. The countless hours of driving carpools, staying up with sick kids, managing the small daily logistics of raising 2 children largely on her own after the divorce, while I worked long hours even after we split, building the business up further before I finally sold it. I have never denied that. What I could not accept, what had kept me up for weeks, was the specific, deliberate lie, the sentence your dad gave us nothing, repeated apparently more than once, that erased 8 years of documented, undeniable financial support and let our children believe I had simply walked away. Preston set the wedding invoice down slowly. He looked at his mother for a long moment, and then he looked at me. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked. There wasn't anger in it yet either, just a kind of exhausted confusion. "Any of this? Why did you let us think this?" I felt my throat tighten. This was the question I'd been dreading the most, more than any confrontation with Diane, because the honest answer implicated me too. "Because I thought it was the right thing to do," I said. "I thought if I helped quietly, without needing credit, without making your mother look bad in front of you, that it would mean more somehow. I thought silence was generous. I've had a lot of weeks to think about that decision, Preston, and I've come to understand it wasn't generous. It was a mistake. It let a lie grow in the space where the truth should have been, and it cost me 8 years of you both, maybe not fully trusting that I loved you the way I did. I'm sorry for that. I really am. But I am not sorry for the money, and I am not sorry for finally putting it on this table." The room was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and, somewhere upstairs, the faint sound of the baby monitor picking up Josie's even breathing. Diane finally reached out and picked up one of the bank statements. Scanning it the way you scan something you already know is going to say what you're afraid it says. "You could have helped more," she said, and her voice had gone thin now, defensive in a way I recognized from 31 years of marriage, the sound of someone backed into a corner reaching for whatever's nearest. "You have no idea what it was like raising 2 kids mostly alone while you were off running that business 70 hours a week. I'm not arguing that raising them was hard on you," I said. "I never once said that. What I'm asking you to explain, in front of them, right now, is why you told them I gave nothing when there are 8 years of records sitting on this table saying otherwise." She didn't have an answer. I watched her search for one, watched her mouth open and close twice, and nothing came out that could survive contact with the paper in front of her. Kayla was the one who finally broke the silence, and when she did, her voice had steadied into something quieter and harder than I'd ever heard from her before. "Mom, I need you to actually answer him. I've spent years feeling guilty for even liking Dad as much as I do, because you always made it sound like he abandoned us financially, and I was somehow being disloyal by still loving him. Was that true or not?" Diane's eyes filled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. The way you feel sorry for anyone watching a story they've told themselves for years finally collapse under its own weight. "It wasn't fair," she said finally, so quiet I almost missed it. "He got to leave the marriage and still be the hero because he sent checks. I was the one there every single day. I wanted you to see how hard it was on me too. So you lied," Preston said. Flat. Final. "I didn't think of it as lying," Diane said, and even she seemed to hear how thin that sounded the moment it left her mouth. "I didn't say anything else for a while. I let it sit. The way Marlene had told me a good truth needs room to breathe before anyone tries to argue with it." Kayla was crying quietly now, not dramatically, just steady tears while she held the tuition receipt in both hands like it might disappear if she let go. Preston had gotten up and walked to the window, his back to the room, his shoulders tight. "I want you both to know something," I said finally, and I made sure my voice reached both of them. "I never once, in 8 years, wanted you to think less of your mother. That was never the goal of any of this. I paid quietly because I loved you and I wanted you protected. Full stop. No strings, no scoreboard. I only brought all this out tonight because I couldn't sit across a table one more year and be called a man who gave his children nothing, when the truth is I have never, for one single month in your entire adult lives, stopped showing up for you financially, even after the marriage ended, even after your mother remarried her own version of the story." Preston turned back around. His eyes were red. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A big one. I've said things to people, Dad, about you, based on what Mom told us. I told Renata's parents you basically walked away after the divorce. I need to call them. I need to fix that. You don't owe me anything tonight except honesty going forward," I told him. "That's all I ever wanted." Kayla stood up and walked around the table and hugged me, the tuition receipt still crumpled in one hand against my back, and she didn't say anything for a long moment, just held on the way she used to when she was small and scared of thunderstorms and would climb into bed between me and Diane at 2 in the morning. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled against my shoulder. "I always kind of wondered," she said. "There were things that didn't add up. The car. The way Mom always got vague about the wedding money. I think some part of me knew, and I just didn't want to think Mom would actually lie about something that big. I didn't say anything to that. I just held on to her. Diane left about 20 minutes later. Nobody stopped her. There wasn't a big scene, no raised voices, no dramatic exit line. She just quietly gathered her coat and her purse, said something about being tired, and Preston walked her to her car without a word passing between them that I could hear from inside. I watched through the window as she sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before finally pulling out of the driveway, and I understood, watching her taillights disappear down the street, that something between all of us had shifted permanently that night, and there was no putting it back the way it was before. I didn't know it yet, standing in Kayla's living room with a 2-inch binder of evidence scattered across her dining table. But the hardest conversation of that whole holiday season wasn't actually behind me. It was still coming, 3 days later, when Preston called and asked if he could come by the house alone. He showed up on a Friday afternoon in late December, snow starting to fall in that thin, half-hearted way it does in Tulsa, more threat than accumulation. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent that sleepless night after Thanksgiving, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, just turned a coffee mug slowly in his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, "and I need you to not be mad at me, because I've been carrying it for a while, and I think you deserve to know now that everything's out." I told him I wasn't going anywhere. Mom used to tell us, when we were younger, right after the divorce, that you'd probably remarry someday and forget about us financially. That men do that. She said it like a warning, like she was preparing us for something. And every time you helped with something, my tuition, the wedding, whatever, she'd find a way to explain it that didn't involve you being generous. Either it was something the court made you do, or it was something she'd secretly covered and you just wrote the check for the paperwork, or it just never came up at all and we assumed it was her. I think, looking back, she needed us to believe she was the only one who showed up. And I let her, because it was easier than questioning it, and because some part of me, honestly, was still a little angry at you for the divorce in the first place, even though I never told you that. "You were allowed to be angry," I said. "I wasn't a perfect husband to your mother." That part of what she felt wasn't invented. "Maybe not," Preston said. "But she took something that was real, that you working too much when we were kids, and she turned it into a story where you also abandoned us financially after the divorce, when that part just wasn't true. And I believed the whole story because it was easier than untangling which parts were fair and which parts weren't." I thought about that for a long time after he left that afternoon. I still think about it. Because I understood, sitting alone in my kitchen with the snow finally starting to stick to the windowsill, that Diane hadn't built her story out of nothing. There had been real grievances buried under the false ones. Real years where I'd chosen the business over bedtime stories. Real weekends I'd promised, and then canceled because a commercial account needed emergency service. She'd taken something true and used it as cover for something false, and the two had gotten so tangled together in our children's memory that it took 8 years and a leather portfolio full of bank statements to pull them apart. I want to tell you what happened over the following months, because this is where the story becomes, I think, less about the reveal and more about what actually gets rebuilt after a reveal like that. Preston called Renata's parents that same week and corrected the record, told them plainly that he'd had bad information about how the divorce settlement had actually played out, and that his father had, in fact, paid for a significant portion of the wedding itself. It cost him something to make that call. I know it did, because he told me afterward it was one of the more uncomfortable conversations he'd had in years. But he made it anyway, and that mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened that whole season. Kayla started calling me every Sunday afternoon, a standing ritual that's continued ever since, usually with Josie babbling in the background, sometimes with Dev on speakerphone too. She told me once, a few months into it, that she'd started to feel like she was making up for lost time, years where she'd unconsciously held me at a slight distance because some part of her believed the story her mother had told. I told her she didn't owe me any making up. I told her the years ahead of us mattered a great deal more than the ones behind us. I meant that. Diane and I have not fully repaired things, and I want to be honest about that too, because I don't believe in pretending every ending wraps up in a neat bow. We are civil now, mostly for the sake of Josie and whatever grandchildren might come along after her. She has never, to this day, offered me a full apology, though Kayla told me privately that her mother did eventually admit in a quieter moment between just the two of them, that she'd let her own hurt turn into something she shouldn't have said. I've decided to let that be enough, because chasing a fuller apology from someone who isn't ready to give one is its own kind of exhausting, and I've done enough waiting in my life. But there is one more part of this story I want to tell you, because it's the part that actually kept me up at night in the best possible way, the part that reminded me why any of this mattered in the first place. My sister Connie, the one who told me on the phone that morning after Thanksgiving that silence doesn't defend you, had been quietly standing beside me through every part of this, not just with advice, but in ways I only fully understood looking back. She'd been the one, years earlier, back in 2018, who noticed I looked exhausted and worn down after months of secretly covering both the court-ordered support and the extra payments on top of running my business, and she'd started showing up on Sunday afternoons with a casserole and just sitting with me, not asking questions, just being present, the way good family does when they sense something's heavy even if they don't know exactly what. I never told Connie, in all those years, exactly how much I was sending Diane every month. I never wanted her to worry about me, and I certainly never wanted her to think less of Diane in front of the kids, the same instinct toward quiet generosity that had gotten me into this whole mess in the first place. But Connie had believed me the second I told her the truth about that Thanksgiving comment. No hesitation, no need for proof, just immediate, unwavering loyalty, the kind that doesn't ask to see a bank statement before deciding whose side it's on. In February, after everything with Preston and Kayla had settled into its new, steadier shape, I drove out to Owasso and sat with Connie and Gary at their kitchen table, and I told her I wanted to do something for her. She waved me off at first, the way she always does, told me she didn't do any of it expecting something back. I told her that was exactly why she deserved it. Connie and Gary had been renting their house in Owasso for 11 years, always meaning to buy, but never quite getting the down payment together after Gary's hours got cut back during a rough stretch at the plant where he worked. I'd known that for a long time, filed it away the same way I file away most things, quietly, without saying much about it. That February afternoon, I told Connie I wanted to cover the down payment on a house for her and Gary, no loan, no strings, a real gift this time, one I intended to make sure everyone in the family knew about from the start, because I'd learned my lesson about quiet generosity, leaving too much room for someone else to rewrite the story. Connie cried at that kitchen table in a way I hadn't seen her cry since our own mother passed back in 2009. Gary, a quiet man who doesn't say much even on his best days, just reached over and shook my hand and held onto it a beat longer than a handshake usually lasts. They closed on a 3-bedroom house on a half-acre lot outside Owasso that April. I was there the day they moved in, carrying boxes with Preston and Dev, while Kayla kept Josie entertained on a blanket in the front yard. Connie stood in her new kitchen, still mostly empty boxes stacked against the walls, and she looked at me across the room and said, "You didn't have to do this, Walt." "I know," I told her. "That's exactly why I did." I think about that day often, more than I think about the night at Kayla's dining table with the binder spread out across the tablecloth, if I'm honest. Because that night was about proving something, about finally being seen clearly after 8 years of being misunderstood. But the day in Connie's new kitchen was about something quieter and, I've come to believe, more important. It was about making sure the people who stood by me without ever asking for proof, without ever needing a bank statement to decide whether I was worth believing, knew exactly how much that loyalty had meant. Kayla still calls every Sunday. Josie is old enough now to say Grandpa Walt clear as day, and she says it like it's the most obvious thing in the world, no hesitation in it at all, the way small children say things before anyone's ever taught them to doubt. Preston brings his kids by more often too, now that Renata's expecting their second, and last month he asked me, almost shy about it, if I'd be willing to help teach his oldest boy how to read a wiring diagram someday the way my father taught me. I told him I'd like nothing more. I think about that Thanksgiving table often, the specific quiet of it, the sound of Diane's coffee cup clicking against the saucer right before she said the sentence that unraveled 8 years of careful silence. I used to believe that quiet generosity was the highest form of love a man could offer, that doing right by people without needing credit for it was somehow more honorable than doing right and making sure they knew it. I don't believe that anymore, not entirely. I believe love without truth attached to it leaves too much open ground, Too much room for somebody else to plant a different story in the space where yours should have been standing. I still believe in generosity. I still believe in giving without keeping score. But I no longer believe silence is generous. Sometimes silence is just an unlocked door, and you never know who's going to walk through it and rearrange the furniture while you're not looking. These days, most evenings, I sit out on my back porch on Birchbrook Ridge with a cup of coffee going lukewarm beside me, watching the sun go down over the tree line. And some Sundays the whole crew comes by, Preston and Renata and their kids, Kayla and Dev and Josie. Sometimes even Connie and Gary driving in from Owasso. And the yard fills up with noise the way it used to when Preston and Kayla were small, and this house felt like it could barely hold all the life happening inside it. I look around at all of them sometimes, mid-conversation, mid-laughter, and I think about that leather portfolio still sitting on a shelf in my closet, 8 years of bank statements and receipts, and one thank you card that once meant more to me than almost anything else in this whole story. I don't need it anymore. Nobody's questioning where I stood those 8 years, not now. But I keep it anyway, not as a weapon, not as proof, just as a reminder of something I learned the hard way and never plan to forget again. The people who love you deserve the truth, plainly told, long before they ever have reason to doubt it. I gave my children silence for 8 years, thinking it was a gift. It wasn't. The truth was the gift, and it was long overdue. Word count, 6604.